"The unexamined life is not worth living." This phrase of Socrates, the key figure in Western philosophy, has been echoing in the minds of Russians for a long time. Russian soldiers thrown into the Ukrainian front lines are beginning to question Putin's war. But the Russians cannot find satisfactory answers as a result of the interrogation. As it is known, when Russian leader Vladimir Putin started the Ukraine war, he sent a flock of soldiers to the front lines while the front lines were on fire with fierce struggles. Russian losses reached gigantic proportions in the middle of this flame. The Russian soldiers who had to deal with the increase in casualties, the decrease in ammunition reserves, supply problems, and many other problems had a very difficult time focusing on the war. Most of the soldiers on the front lines lost their lives in the fierce fighting, in addition to the soldiers who lost their lives. Tens of thousands of soldiers were injured in the clashes. Fortunately, the surviving Russian soldiers began to question the purpose of this dramatic picture, realizing the meaninglessness of the war. The Russians embarked on a quest to save themselves from this pathetic scene at the end of the search. The Russian soldiers reached the merciful embrace of Ukraine. Military strategists in Ukraine realized that when fighting against the Russians, the best way to win was not only through force but also through psychology. Ukrainian authorities launched the I Want to Live hotline to provide step-by-step information on leaving the ranks to Russian soldiers who want to surrender. The program, originally run by the Ukrainian police, has an accelerated version that has been run by the military since mid-September. About 3,200 Russian soldiers surrendered to Ukraine last month, according to reports from Ukrainian officials involved in the project. More than 16,000 Russian applicants have surrendered since the start of the project, Vitaly Matvienko, head of the Ukraine hotline, said in a statement. In the statement, the Ukrainian official added that the number of Russian applications increased by 10% from March to April. Analysts report that this trend will likely continue as Russians sent to the front see voluntary surrender as the best option. The project was created to provide Russian and Belarusian military personnel to escape the war in Ukraine. But in a tweet, the Ukrainian Defense Ministry used the surrender project as a mockery against the Kremlin. Ukraine's Defense Ministry said the closer the counterattack, the hotter the surrender season. Do not wait for the heat. The most favorable conditions are now. The statements of the Ministry of Defense once again reveal the helplessness of the Kremlin with the massive surrender of Russian soldiers. Vladimir Putin is drifting into deep loneliness with each passing day. While the I Want to Live project is a source of embarrassment for Putin, it gives hope to Russian soldiers. The project offers those who surrender 3 meals a day, health care, and possible contact with relatives. The project also complies with the Geneva Conventions on providing assistance and legal assistance through various international organizations. The I Want to Live helpline receives around 80 calls per day. The calls come mainly from Moscow and Leningrad regions, as well as Chelyabinsk, Novgorod, and occupied Donetsk, Luhansk, and Crimea. Russian President Vladimir Putin's troops are surrendering at an increasing rate in the ongoing war in Ukraine, according to Ukraine's main intelligence directorate. Ukrainian officials said that a website created for Russian soldiers who wanted to surrender had attracted more than 16 million visitors in the last 8 months. About 84% of the visitors were from Russia. The Ukrainian Defense Ministry said in a statement that the sharp increase in the number of Russian troops who wanted to surrender to save their lives was due to the expected spring counterattack by the Kiev army. Ukraine's defense ministry warned that the window of opportunity to surrender is narrowing. Ukraine, on the other hand, developed new strategies and displayed remarkable creativity to persuade Russian soldiers to surrender. Ukrainian troops printed special leaflets and stuffed them into shells. They fire them from Russian-occupied territory with a Grad rocket launcher. The brochures also contain phone numbers that Russians can call if they want to turn themselves in. A price list showing how much money you can make if you surrender with equipment is also included in the brochures. Analysts say that unlike Russia, the rights of prisoners of war in Ukraine are respected. They predict that more and more Russians will surrender, noting that Ukraine also complies with the Geneva Conventions. In another development, Ukrainian Ombudsman Dmytro Loibnitz confirmed that a monitoring mission in one of the camps where Russian prisoners were held confirmed that the treatment of prisoners met international standards. The mission to monitor the camps where Russian prisoners were held was carried out by Loibnitz and his team. Loibnitz shared on its Telegram channel that it was determined that Russian prisoners of war were held in accordance with the requirements of the Geneva Convention on the treatment of prisoners of war. Loibnitz said the temperature conditions and daily routine at the facilities meet all the requirements of the contract. According to him, Russian prisoners have the right to communicate and work with their relatives alternately through periodic phone calls. Russians are fed a military menu. Human rights and social activist Tatiana Ivanova said that when the Russians were taken prisoner, the conditions of captivity were not degrading. She said, "Of course it's not a resort, but everything is organized there. Of course they are in custody, but they are kept separate from criminals. They are not kept in the same cells as criminals." According to Ivanova, the surrendered Russian soldiers are ready to work on construction sites in Ukraine and repair what they have destroyed. And some posts swear not to return to Russia after their release because the Russians know what awaits them at home. As a result, the attitude of the Kiev government is quite humane. Despite the aggressive attitude of the Russian leader and the wind of fear he has blown on the territory of Ukraine, the leader of Kiev is struggling to offer more humane living conditions to the Russian soldiers. Tensions rise on the front lines with each passing day, and the Russian soldiers who are not satisfied with the situation have only one way out. The end of this way out leads to the project, "I want to live. Apart from that, I want to live." Project Victory Day also reveals the desperation of Vladimir Putin. For Putin, the Victory Day parade on Red Square this year was a chance to continue his war against history. This march only managed to underline its geopolitical isolation. In his speech in front of the assembled troops, Putin drew a direct line between the Ukrainian war and the sacrifices of World War II. For a local audience, the Victory Day parade provides a visual parallel between veterans of the war that ended 78 years ago and those involved in Russia's war against Ukraine today. The Russian president has portrayed himself as the savior and defender of embattled Russia, targeted by the globalist elite of the West. Putin said that today's civilization is at the breaking point again. He stated that a real war has been waged against their homeland. He claimed that dark forces are conspiring against Moscow. Also, according to state media, more than 500 people participating in Russia's so-called special military operation in Ukraine took part in the parade held in Red Square. In his speech, Putin cited them as the heirs of victory in the Great Patriotic War. Unsurprisingly, Ukrainians are taking a step back against this type of historic gaslighting. In the video comment, Volodymyr Zelensky expressed that he has submitted a bill to the Verkhovna Rada, the parliament of Ukraine, to change the official Victory Day celebrations from May 9th to May 8th. Zelensky compared Russia's aggression to that of Hitler's Germany. The leader of Kiev said, "We will not allow the joint victory of the nations of the anti-Hitler coalition to be claimed, and we will not allow lies if the victory can be lived without the participation of any country or nation." In summary, the successful advance of Ukraine has significantly affected and changed the lives of both Russian soldiers and Vladimir Putin. Putin is one step closer to losing his soldiers and his reputation. "I Want to Live" project and historical celebrations reveal these losses. Will the Russian leader be able to cope with these losses? We'll wait and see. Over the last several months, the Ukrainians have been visibly slowing down, and some people concluded that the Ukrainian command is losing its edge and making mistakes by not continuing to push. However, by slowing down their offensive actions, the Ukrainians were able to save much more equipment, build up the reserves, and prepare for the next counter-offensive operation. And today we'll tell you exactly how they did it. As many noticed, the number and intensity of Ukrainian attacks have been slowly decreasing, while the Russians slowly switched from passive defense to active defense and later started switching from active defense to offense. The reason why the Ukrainian momentum has been slowing down is twofold. First of all, the Ukrainians have a very limited number of equipment, especially artillery and tanks, which are indispensable for offensive operations. Of course, the losses of equipment are very high when you conduct offensive actions, which is why you need to stop at the right time. Otherwise, very soon you will have nothing to fight with. That is why the Ukrainian offensive operation in the Kharkiv region has been slowing down, and the Ukrainians went from taking vast areas in a matter of days to taking cities, to taking villages, to now fighting for individual positions. Being short on the equipment also means that the Ukrainians are betting a substantial proportion of their mechanized army on every offensive operation. So one failed operation can lead to the loss of almost all heavy equipment and virtually fool the militarization. One mistake can cost everything. However, the number of equipment is shrinking even if you do not attack, although it shrinks significantly slower. And even if a vehicle is not destroyed, it has a limited, useful time and must be removed from the front for operation of guns. For example, after a certain number of shots or tracks after a certain number of kilometers, the Ukrainian command is continuously faced with incredibly difficult choices. They need to stop offensive actions at the optimal time. They need to build up reserves during the defensive period, and they need to prepare and commit this reserves to the next offensive operation as soon as possible with no margin for error. The second reason why the Ukrainian momentum has been slowing down is that the Russians finally deployed their mobilized troops that were undergoing training in Belarus, and they also delivered another batch of conscripts for Wagner Group, private military company. That is how the Russians managed to flood the solitary front line with troops and breach the Ukrainian defense. And they overcommitted their troops despite her losses deliberately. They know that the Ukrainians are preparing for the next offensive operation, and they know that the tanks will soon arrive. So what they are trying to do is to force the Ukrainians to burn these precious reserves in an attempt to stabilize the situation. But the Ukrainian command knows the price, and that is why sometimes certain territories are deliberately not saved and certain counterattacks are deliberately not conducted. However important Solider was ensuring the success of the next massive counter-offensive operation is much more important. And when it comes to the next Ukrainian counter-offensive, the Ukrainians have three options. First of all, when the tanks and artillery arrive, the Ukrainians can conduct a small-scale offensive operation and take Kremenna and Svardov. Most analysts agree that the Russians are preparing for an offensive operation here. If the Ukrainians manage to push the Russians from Terminal Svardov, the Russian offensive operation will land before it even starts. So this is more of a preventative action. The second option is to conduct a large-scale offensive operation in the Zaporizhia region. Here the Ukrainians need to get to Melitopol, which will effectively cut off the Russians in Kherson by using longer-range missiles. The Ukrainians will be able to destroy the bridges from Crimea and create exactly the same situation as in Kherson. And there are a lot of indicators that the Ukrainians are preparing to do it, such as the recent destruction of another bridge around Melitopol and the fact that they are not committing certain mechanized and tank brigades to the front. The third option is to conduct both operations, but as you understand, it will largely depend on how many pieces of equipment they receive and how quickly. Based on the NUN's terms of delivery, the next Ukrainian offensive operation is planned for late spring. Overall, because the Ukrainians are dealing with a scarcity of equipment, they cannot afford to continuously push. They can only afford to conduct rapid but short-term, large-scale breakthroughs. But such breakthroughs require the Ukrainians to temporarily slow down and build up their reserves for the next counteroffensive. Judging by the delivery times, the Ukrainians should be able to start their next counteroffensive in late spring. The main goal for now is to retain control over tactically important positions that will allow starting the counteroffensive under more favorable conditions. Tensions between the US and Russia have escalated while the whole world was waiting for the war between Russia and Ukraine to end. The war between the US and Russia has begun. The US Air Force shot down Russian leader Vladimir Putin's favorite fighter jet in the Baltic Sea. The US, which has been providing military equipment and financial support to the Ukrainian army since the beginning of the war, has come face to face with Russia in recent weeks. Tensions between the US and Russia have increased after a US Air Force drone was shot down in the Black Sea. The Russian government initially denied shooting down the US drone. However, the US government proved that Russian warplanes had shot down the US drone, with images obtained from the wreckage of the downed drone. A few days after this incident, the Pentagon decided to send US warplanes to the Baltic Sea. US officials warned the Finnish government after Russian President Vladimir Putin began deploying troops to the Finnish border after Finland's accession to NATO. Vladimir Putin began to deploy troops and tanks to the Finnish border. Not only that, Putin sent Russian Navy ships to the port of St. Petersburg and started making threatening moves against Finland. The US government took action after Finnish President Sauli Niinisto said that the Russian army was very close to the Finnish border and he was worried that Vladimir Putin might attempt a new invasion. With the order of U.S. Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin, Tu-52H fighter jets of the U.S. Air Force moved towards the Baltic Sea. The American warplanes, which were sent to locate the Russian Navy ships anchored in the Baltic Sea, were exposed to the threat of the Russian Air Force. The U.S. warplanes, which entered the radar of the Russian air defense systems, alarmed Russia with the order of the Russian Defense Ministry as U-35 fighter jets of the air defense units of the Western Military District took action on the grounds that U.S. warplanes violated Russia's borders. Russian fighter jets approached the U.S. warplanes hovering over the Baltic Sea and called on them to turn back. After this call by the Russian pilots, the U.S. warplanes left the Baltic Sea and moved away from the region. The Russian Defense Ministry later said in a statement that they did not allow the violation of Russia's borders and that they had to repel the U.S. warplanes in accordance with international rules. However, the harassment of U.S. aircraft by Russian warplanes was not welcomed by the U.S. Defense Ministry. A few days after this incident, the U.S. Air Force F-35 fighter jets destroyed a Su-35 fighter jets of the Russian Air Force. The F-35 fighter jets, the most popular fighter jets of the U.S., are known as stealth fighters. US Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin stated that U.S. planes sent for reconnaissance in the past days were harassed by Russian fighter jets, but this time they will organize a reconnaissance flight in the region with F-13 fighter jets, stating that they will not allow Vladimir Putin's aggressive behavior against Finland, which is on the way to becoming a NATO member country. The U.S. Defense Secretary stated that they have to monitor the movements of the Russian army shortly after the defense minister's statement. 35 fighter jets moved towards the Baltic Sea. 3 F-35 fighter jets enter the Baltic Sea airspace and started flying near Finland and Russia. American pilots saw Russian Navy ships leaving the port of St. Petersburg and realized that Russian ships were anchored off the coast of Finland, while the U.S. pilots were reporting the situation. And as U-35 fighter jet of the Russian Air Force suddenly appeared, the Russian Su-35 fighter jet, which was chasing the U.S. warplanes, told the U.S. pilots that they had violated the border and asked them to leave the area quickly. Although U.S. warplanes fly in international airspace, Russia does not want U.S. warplanes in the Baltic region. US pilots who refused to leave the region were subjected to harassment by the Russian fighter jet. The Russian pilot, flying very close to the U.S. warplanes, caused the U.S. pilots to lose patience, unable to withstand the harassment of the Russian fighter jet any longer. The American pilots used jammers to disrupt the Russian fighter jets' radar, vision, and systems. The Russian pilot was forced to land at the military airport in St. Petersburg after the systems failed. However, the Russian pilot had problems landing on the runway due to the jammer used by the U.S. fighter jets. The Russian fighter jet, whose landing gear did not work, had to crash on the runway. The Russian fighter jet, which drifted on the runway for a long time, was able to stop by hitting the sand at the end of the runway. After the plane crashed, the Russian pilot barely saved himself from the flames. After the Russian fighter jet crashed, U.S. fighter jets left the Baltic Sea and returned to the U.S. airspace. Russian media reported that the Su-35 fighter jet was shot down by the U.S. and that the U.S. was trying to start a war with Russia. However, it was the Russian fighter jet that first harassed the U.S. fighter jets. The jammer used by the American pilots damaged the landing gear of the Russian fighter jet, causing it to crash. Many war analysts say this was deliberate and that the U.S. retaliated after Russia shot down a U.S. drone. While the whole world was waiting for the war between Russia and Ukraine to come to an end, such a move by the U.S. surprised everyone. Although the U.S. has provided many military equipment support for the Ukrainian army, this is the first time it has officially damaged a Russian military vehicle. Could the ongoing conflict between the U.S. and Russia be the beginning of a new war? Researchers say that a third world war is inevitable if tensions between the U.S. and Russia continue. This time, however, the war will not only be between the U.S. and Russia, but between all allies. If the U.S. goes to war with Russia, NATO member states will also have to get involved. However, many believe that Russia is too weak to fight another war. The Russian army, which has occupied Ukrainian territory for more than a year, has lost more than 165,000 soldiers. The Russian army, which has lost military equipment such as many tanks, armored vehicles, and ammunition, is quite exhausted. According to allegations, the Russian army has consumed more than 50% of its ammunition inventory. In fact, Russia's request for military equipment support from allied countries such as Iran, Syria, and Belarus proves this. In addition, the Russian people are not ready for another war. While the majority of Russian citizens want the Russian army to withdraw from Ukrainian territory, it seems unlikely that Vladimir Putin will go to war with America. The recent explosions and fires in Russia are also putting Vladimir Putin under a lot of pressure. While the Russian people's trust in Putin is decreasing over time, the Russian leader is trying to regain the trust of the Russian people. However, after the recent allegations that a new mobilization decision will be announced in Russia, the Russian people are in a very uneasy situation. Putin, who forcibly included 300,000 Russian citizens in the Russian army in the previous partial mobilization decision, now wants to include 500,000 more Russian citizens in the Russian army by declaring a full mobilization decision. But if this happens, it will lead to a major uprising in Russia. Do you think Vladimir Putin can afford a new uprising of the Russian people in the streets?